Right, we seem to have settled on a figure of 210 pretty much. I'm sure that'll change. I'm sure it'll increase. But ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. I think we'll make a start. Can you all hear me? Well, at least my colleagues can hear me at least, and I'm assuming that everybody else can. Welcome to this Environment and Society discussion series event on the Ukraine war and threats to food and energy security. We're on day 49 of this horrific war, and as bad as it continues to be, and I'm afraid looks set to continue to be, I'm constantly impressed with my colleagues' abilities to see this invasion from multiple angles and using their pre-existing knowledge and experience to warn of the cascading effects. I think they don't call them secondary effects because they're as real and as life impacting as any we see through a traditional security or regional lens. And so the other parts of Chatham House, which we often concentrate on. So I think this is as real as the effects on the lives of people in Ukraine, as the effects on democracy, as the effects on European security. I wouldn't call them ripple effects either, by the way, because it seems to me that ripples dissipate as they get further from the center. Cascading effect seems entirely appropriate to convey the global reach of this war, because it demands such really integral questions as, will my lights stay on? Will my house stay warm? Will I have enough to eat? Will my nutritional health be affected? Some of the most fundamental rights in life. So with extraordinary deftness, it seems to me, the Environment and Society Programme, with the help of others in Chatham House, has managed to produce a full, comprehensive, peer-reviewed paper within 49 days, probably 40 days or so, on the effects of this disastrous war, particularly on energy security and food security. To do that, we've got three of the lead authors. I'll just go from them very, very briefly. I'm sure you know them. Professor Tim Benton has been consistently demoted while he's been at Chatham House. I think he started as a distinguished fellow and now he's a lowly program director. And he'll set the scene for us to start with. Anthony Froggatt is a deputy director of the same program and looks at the energy transition in particular with regards to climate change. And last but not least, Laura Wellesley is a senior research fellow in the same program again, and her main areas of research interest are the policy strategies to promote healthy and sustainable diets and food system transformation. So that's what we're going to go through. So that's my opening salvo, if you will. And I'm going to turn to Tim first. I'm going to ask each of these players a couple of questions each. That might last for about half an hour. And then we'll go to questions, which I think I'm told you put in the Q&A. Ideally, I'll unmute a few of you and I'll read out a few and we'll play it like that. So Tim, over to you. Now, I don't know you well enough, Tim, to know if you're a sort of a pessimist or an optimist, but I do know you're a scientist. And I also do know that you are you weren't especially enthused about the prospects for what was happening in the world system as far as its impact upon climate change and what happened with COVID-19 impacted on where we are. So I was hoping you would just set the scene on how this latest catastrophe to hit the world has impacted upon on these elements, how it impacts on key choke points, how it impacts upon pipelines, not literal oil pipelines, but on the world system as we see it, and where you saw it up to now, and then perhaps just a little bit, and I will come back to you on it, Tim, on how much worse this makes everything without being too doom and gloom. I can add a little bit of optimism to the end of this if need be, if we're all in sort of slit wrist mode. But where do you see us? Where did you see us before now?
So thanks, James, for a comprehensive question. I think there were two things to point out, perhaps three things to point out. In the short term, as we came up to this crisis, we were in the post-COVID reconstruction phase. And as you recall, of course, COVID and the lockdowns associated with it caused a demand side shock, supply withered away. And then as vaccines came along and governments let us back out of lockdown, economies woke up and supply and demand were out of balance. And that's the story of kind of 2021 last year, that imbalance, supply chain disruptions, etc., was starting to drive up inflationary pressures for food and for energy, and as we remember. So that's the kind of short term of where we were. But then if you think back before 2019, before the pandemic, we've had, over the last 15 years, we've had the 2007-8 financial crisis, 2007-8 food price spike, 2010-11 food price spike, the Arab Spring, Syria, Trump and the rise of nationalism, trade war between the US and China. We've had Brexit, we've had a messy exit from Afghanistan, and we've had COVID. All of that in 15 years, and we have spent so long responding to crises that we have taken our eye off the ball a little bit, that our system is very low in resilience. And on top of that, we all know that we're in a situation where our system has been driven primarily from an economic growth consideration perspective, and it is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for biodiversity, it's unsustainable for climate, blah, blah, blah. We all know that, and that we have to transition our food system, our energy system, and our economies towards more sustainability. Now, of course, that comes back into some of the kind of the geopoliticals of the situation. If we are, as we talked about in COP26 in Glasgow last year, if most of the world is seeing a future where it's weaning itself off fossil fuels, what does that mean from a transition perspective, both for the countries that are moving towards using less fossil fuels, but particularly for countries like Russia, whose a lot of their economic power comes from fossil fuels? So there's a question there about the existential threat to the future of the transition agenda. And then you've also got the question that if we are moving towards more sustainable economies, we are going to use land in different ways. Demand for food is going up, demand for land for carbon storage and biomass is also going up. So whilst the economics and the economic power associated with fossil fuels is declining, that of land is going up. And Ukraine is a very fertile chunk of land. And one of the questions that is worth kind of considering was the invasion, part of the invasion, driven by the existential threat to the transforming economy out of fossil fuels, by the growth of the strategic asset value of land, particularly Ukraine, coupled with these last 15 years of shocks that has led us to a weakened multilateral architecture, more nation state competition, and what can be perceived as a lack of international cooperation in the wider sense. So did all of these things come together to provide the fertile ground for the political moment that was the invasion?
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. That's a great scene setter, and I will come back to you in a few minutes. Anthony, I'm going to turn to you. And of course, Tim's just been talking about the existential threat of a transition agenda. Could you do two things for us, perhaps? First, talk about just how important you see Russia and Ukraine in their different roles as being to global energy markets. Obviously, everyone's bills, I'm sure they've noticed already, are much higher now. But beyond that sort of superficial level, what if Russia is going to be somewhat removed from the energy market due to its toxicity right now, then what are the impacts of that? And then secondly, if I just give you two at once, if that's okay, Anthony, how far do you see us? Is this, I don't want to say there's a silver lining because the war's too horrific, Anthony, but is there in any way you see this as sort of a good thing, quote unquote, because it is going to hasten this transition? That actually although yes, people are looking for alternative sources of LNG, but that's not good enough. They're actually looking for renewables now, and they're looking. And Russia. How do I put this? I remember Russia was cutting off Ukraine's energy supply back in 2007. That wasn't the impetus we sort of needed. The people started looking at interconnectors and reverse flows, but there wasn't really a big move back then. Maybe now, this time, it's different. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. It is the question in terms of what impact are we seeing and how does that take us forward? I think it's first to recognize that the often geopolitical tensions and geopolitical crisis lead to an increase in energy prices and raw materials, gold, etc. So not surprising, I guess, in general, that geopolitical tension such as this has increased energy prices. But the degree to which it's happened is obviously been amplified because of the importance of Russia rather than Russia and Ukraine, Russia as a global producer of fuels. And roughly 10% of global energy production comes from Russia. Most of that is then exported. What is relatively unique is that that is across the fossil fuels. So it's gas, it's oil, and it's coal, and to some extent uranium, but let's just focus on the fossil fuels. And they are exported, obviously coal and oil in particular go onto global markets, but gas is more directional because a lot of the gas is through pipelines. And that is why, or in particular Russia's gas is exported to Europe through pipelines. Obviously you can't export that to other places so easily. And that is why Europe, and again, in particular, in relation to gas, is so dependent on Russia. So Europe, maybe be more specific in terms of the EU. So the EU imports 60% of its energy, and that has changed over time and increased its import dependency because of reductions in productions, either for political reasons to some degree in terms of coal, or for resource reasons as they've become depleted in terms of oil and gas. But that dependency has increased, and at the same time, their dependency on Russia has increased. And so, yeah, as people know, in terms of between 35 and 40% of all gas consumed in the EU comes from Russia. Smaller dependencies in terms of oil and coal, but still hugely significant. And that makes a difference in terms of the political reaction that we can see, but also it's an economic question. And as was pointed out, I think last week, Russia is paying around €1 billion a day to Russia for its energy. So there is huge dependency on imported energy, but also to some degree a dependency on Russia on the incomes that they import. UK is slightly different, and it's really worth flagging this now. Obviously, we have domestic energy sources. We have much more gas and oil, and so the UK's dependency on gas from Russia is around 4% and around 8% in relation to oil. So in terms of prices, as I said at the beginning, geopolitical tensions generally lead to higher energy prices, but much more in this case. And we have seen just huge spikes and continual high prices. So oil is now $100 a barrel and has probably been consistently for the last 2 months at this price, when beginning of the year it was around 70 or 80. Tim's point early on in terms of the pandemic, it was down to the 20s in the midst of the pandemic. So we have seen it, obviously it's dependent on demand, and what we've seen the same tendency in terms of supply and demand coming out of kilter and higher prices before the current situation. But now it's clearly much, much worse. And I think many people are forecasting that it is a long-term higher energy prices. So many people are saying $200 a barrel over the midterm. And that clearly changes the way in which people will use energy, but also encouraging the diversifications of different energy sources. So maybe in terms of the response and the so-called silver lining, where does this leave us? I mean, first and foremost, in terms of, as Tim mentioned, in terms of Paris and Glasgow, we know that from a greenhouse gas perspective, we are way off track in terms of the reduction in emissions that we need. Even after the additional pledges, in order to get us back on track, we need to reduce emissions by around 40% from current levels, and current forecasts are increasing emissions. Energy produces around 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there needs to be a significant reduction in the consumption of fossil fuels just by the end of this decade. So we have to have that energy transition. And as you said, do we see higher energy prices, firstly, driving the energy efficiency, driving fuel switching away from fossil fuels? Or do we see a doubling down, and those companies and countries that are less happy to take energy from Russia developing alternative routes and alternative sources? And again, we see mixtures of responses. The EU has given what I was saying before in terms of its high dependency on Russian gas, has a very clear strategy of reducing dependency on gas imports. So its objective is reducing by 60% by the end of this year. And that is through a combination of reasons or a combination of mechanisms. energy efficiency, diversification of supply, and interestingly, diversification of supply. So getting more liquefied natural gas, which you can put on tankers from other parts of the world. But this already has a consequence for those other parts of the world that were buying that LNG. So they were buying it. Europe will now outbid them. And so what will happen in those other parts of the world? They'll probably switch more to coal. So there are ramifications for the global energy system with sudden movement. So front and center, I would say we have to reduce demand. And that is interesting in terms of the Commission's proposals, is they're proposing you can save 10 billion cubic meters of gas a year by encouraging citizens to turn down their thermostats by one degree. Very interesting how that will be encouraged and how that will be achieved. But very clear, it's a win-win situation in terms of not only will it be reducing gas importation, it will also be good in terms of reducing overall gas consumption and therefore speeding up the energy transition. Other options, as I said, other countries may be taking different routes. The UK energy security strategy that was released last week indicates a potential review of fracking. So increasing emissions or increasing gas extraction within the UK on land, and then potentially reviewing oil and gas licenses offshore. So yeah, different responses, but just in terms of the policy response, and one of the things that we look at in this paper is that in some ways a hierarchy of responses. There are those responses that do no harm, and I would put energy efficiency absolutely at the top of that. Secondly, we need to be changing the systems in which we operate energy. And I think storage becomes very high on that list, both in terms of gas, but also in terms of electricity. It is one of the areas that we need to develop more. If we're going to have more reliance on renewables, we need to have better storage. And then the third option is that supply question. And again, maybe do the renewables that are quick and cheap to build, going down to some of the options as less desirable, in particular on the global level.
Anthony, thank you. Can I just push you on a couple of quick things before I move on to Laura? One is, of course, on the nuclear question. Are we going to see? Obviously, France and Germany have gone different ways on this. Germany is obviously being forced to change because of its particular addiction to Russian gas. Do you see a change to nuclear as being likely or improbable or unrealistic or dangerous? Where do you see that? And very quickly, number two, is this an impetus for technological innovation? I mean, part of the problem, as I understand it, for not converting to renewables tomorrow, it's technical, it's chemical, it's chemistry. So do you feel that a global shock like this can increase the impetus for technical change?
Okay, the first question in terms of nuclear, very interesting. And again, different responses. The EU's energy strategy doesn't mention nuclear, but the UK says that in the longer term that it wants to develop more nuclear. And I do think we need to divide in terms of what we think can be achieved on the short term, because nuclear, if we are wanting to build more nuclear power plants, we're not talking about this decade. We're talking about something that may or may not happen in 10, 15 years' time. So it is not a short-term response and should not be seen as that. And if a fault, I would say, on the UK's energy strategies, it's looking long-term. It needs to be looking much more short-term and how to address consumer bills. So I would say nuclear may happen. I think we're in a really different situation in terms of the economics of nuclear. If we compare it to renewable energy sources. I mean, the Hinkley Point C that's being built in the UK, expected costs are £92 a megawatt hour was the strike price, and then offshore wind is around half that. So tends to be more expensive than many renewables. So I think that's an option and a consideration. In terms of your second issue, in terms of technological development, absolutely. I mean, it is these things, these crises where people focus again on energy, focus again on the systems that we need in order to operate the energy system will lead to innovation. And that is what we have seen. And it is a global response as well. I mean, I think that's a really important issue is as energy prices around the world increase, then there is a desire for not just in Europe, not just in the United States, but all countries all over the world, to become less reliant on fossil fuels because they can become more expensive. And that's where you see innovation in India, in China, Latin America, etc. And that's where you see new technologies being developed and deployed. And I think it's those testing of those technologies that enable you to get further cost savings.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we're going to come back to this, but Laura, I've kept you for too long. Can you unmute for a second? I think you're muted. Listen, we're going to turn to food security, of course. And we obviously come out with these phrases of Ukraine's black earth, breadbasket. And so there's a question of the exports of grain, wheat, and other products from both countries, from Ukraine and Russia. And combined with that, there's the fertilizer aspect of the ability to actually grow our own products using products from these areas. So I suppose the question really is, what is the role? I mean, how important do you see these two countries, maybe surrounding countries as well, affected by the potential spillover? How important do you see these countries in that respect? And can you, how will this reduce or how will these exports impact other countries? I mean, what is the effect on? I know in your introductory remarks or in the blurb to this session, we talked about how Somalia is so 100% dependent upon this. Other countries, especially around the region, are in the same way a little bit as energy. The closer you are, geographical proximity has an effect. So, could you talk a little bit, please, Laura, about the importance of food choke points, food security, and particularly on the fertilizer aspect, because the ability to not to be able to grow our own food in a world where we're trying to grow less meat, according to your own research that I've read over the years, Laura, we do need to think very seriously about the ways in which we are sustainably able to grow non-meat products, but it's still going to use stuff emanating from this region. So over to you.
Thanks. And that was a good précis of the issues at stake here, I think. So just to start then on the importance of Russia and Ukraine to global food markets, they are extremely important. There's more of a focus in this discussion in general, I think, on Russia's role as an energy exporter, but there is real concerns here in terms of grain exports, oilseed exports, and fertilizer exports, as you mentioned. So together, Russia and Ukraine account for a quarter of all traded wheat and barley, a sixth of traded maize and rapeseed, and over half of global trade in sunflower seed and oil, a primary cooking oil around the world. Russia is a major supplier of fertilizer, so it supplies 1/6 of global trade in potassic fertilizers, those containing potassium, 1/10 of nitrogenous fertilizers, which are also produced elsewhere, but which depend heavily on natural gas exports from Russia as well, and 1/6 of mixed fertilizers. Much of the crop production in other major breadbasket regions across South America, Central America, Europe, and including Ukraine itself, depends on fertilizer and fertilizer input exports from Russia and from Belarus, which, as Russia's ally, is subject to sanctions, so supply is also curtailed. So in terms of what we've seen since Russia's invasion, the kind of immediate response has largely been a policy response, so broad economic sanctions placed on Russia and export restrictions, export bans imposed by a number of countries. These have contributed to rapidly rising food prices, but it's really this kind of interaction between energy and food markets that's exacerbating the situation. So extremely high energy prices are leading to extremely high fertilizer prices, which in turn have immediate knock-on impacts on food prices. But as you indicated in your introduction, that high fertilizer prices have long-term impacts on food prices, but on food production as well. So to some degree, there's been a feeling that markets will respond, that wheat exports from Russia and Ukraine, any shortfall there can be met by other parts of the system. There's a little bit of comfort to take from the fact that a number of other breadbasket regions saw record harvests at the end of last year when producers responded to already high food prices and ramped up production. But the viability of those harvests over the coming seasons is severely threatened by what are prohibitively high fertilizer prices for many producers. So the impacts on food markets largely are ones of affordability, economic access at the moment, but it's potentially going to lead to supply disruptions down the line as well, which will further exacerbate high food prices. Food prices now are at an all-time high. Wheat futures were trading in the last couple of weeks at 40% higher than they were in early February before the invasion, and 20% higher than they were on the day of invasion. So they are, rising. And it's not just wheat. We've also seen high prices for maize futures and even soybean, which isn't directly affected in terms of supply, but you see these kind of ripple effects, recognize your reluctance to use that word, but spillover effects, I guess, across food commodity markets. So the interconnectedness and the structure of food markets means that increased prices for one food commodity can rapidly lead to increased prices for other food commodities. In terms of physical supply disruptions, there's kind of non-sector specific disruptions that we've seen that contribute to high food prices and to uncertainty in food markets. So port closures in Ukraine, high shipping costs as a result of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov being designated as high risk areas, but also just, many shipping companies pulling out of the region and not operating there. Those have also had knock-on impacts on trade and transportation costs elsewhere. So many countries have reported long delays at ports because customs checks are taking longer as customs authorities are ensuring that there aren't any customs infringements. Equally, as demand kind of pivots away from Russia and Ukraine, we're seeing higher prices in other regions. I think the cost to export down the Mississippi and out of the US Gulf Coast is at an 8-year high, I believe. So, we see impacts not just directly on shipping around Ukraine and Russia, but in other regions as well. And that will continue to happen. If energy prices stay high, then transportation costs will stay high, and it will be increasingly expensive to access key agricultural imports and to export harvested goods. And of course, in Ukraine, we're seeing horrendous, immediate, significant impacts on day-to-day operations, on the ability of any producers in Ukraine to continue doing what they're doing. Many are fighting. Much of the kind of richest agricultural production regions are in the areas of the country where fighting is most intense. Any producers who are able to access their fields and carry on their activities will be struggling to access key inputs like fertilizer and pesticides and fuel for farm machinery. And the FAO predicts that between 20 and 30% of the area usually under production in the UK will either go unplanted or unharvested this season. And I think it's safe to assume that production in Ukraine will suffer for a very long time ahead, however long the conflict lasts. The scale of destruction and upheaval is such that we're not going to see Ukrainian production rebound anytime soon. Equally, fertilizer prices are likely to remain high so long as economic sanctions are in place, which again, I think we're looking at medium to long term here. In terms of countries most affected, low-income, food deficit countries are always the most vulnerable to rising food prices, but actually low-income households in all economies around the world are already experiencing increasing household economic insecurity and food insecurity. So I think this is a global concern, but you mentioned Somalia. 100% of its wheat imports have been coming from Russia and Ukraine, 80% of wheat imports into Egypt, 75% into Sudan, 50% into Yemen. It's a major supply region for the UN World Food Programme. And the World Food Programme is really struggling actually with rising procurement costs and transportation costs, given this situation. So we're not only seeing humanitarian agencies really struggle to reach those in a state of acute insecurity in Ukraine, with the atrocious scenes of besieged cities and people unable to access basic needs. But people in other parts of the world who are heavily reliant on humanitarian food aid at the moment and other forms of aid are going to suffer as well, as agencies struggle to respond and adapt. And the FAO has predicted about 13 million additional people will be undernourished as a result of this conflict, but I suspect that is an underestimate, given the long-term nature and the cascading effects that we're talking about in this paper and in this discussion. If food prices remain high, if harvests outside of Ukraine suffer, as we think they will, from a lack of fertilizers, then the number could be much, much higher. And on top of all this, there's the potential for coincident shocks in harvests in other regions as a result of climate change. So we're seeing drought conditions in the US Midwest, dry conditions across Europe, which threaten wheat production in both countries, potential for La Nina to disrupt yields in South America over the coming season. So the outlook is one of continued disruption and worsening food insecurity, especially in food import-dependent countries, but really around the world.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. Partly for a sort of, not a minor point you made, but a point you made earlier on in the middle of your presentation about Ukrainian farmers are fighting when they should be farming, perhaps. But more than that, I suppose, for stealing maybe some of Tim's thunder, because you really began to drift into cascading risks there. And I wanted to just briefly press Tim a little bit more on that. Tim, I've heard you over the years talk about cascading risks again, as I've followed you, from climate change, from increased hydrocarbons production. I've seen quite a few of your scary graphs and such like, and now we have this again, this new shock. So I wonder, as a large part, or the key research question, if you like, of your paper, of your excellent paper, is on these cascading risks. Could you talk a little bit more about that and say what they might be and how they might be felt even beyond food and fertilizer and energy markets? Whatever, again, this is your license to be a little bit calamitous with us, and just for a couple of minutes, and then I'll have just so as you know, ladies and gents, it's 12:35 by my clock, and I'll probably extend this a little bit beyond the 1 o'clock time. So that's a reason for me going over. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, James. So a cascading risk is where an event somewhere causes ripples that impact across sectors, across geographies, across borders to people living in another place. And the easiest thing to exemplify this is what we're talking about in this paper, which is interruption to supply chains for food, fuel, and fertilizers. And clearly, with all of those three commodities, food, fuel, and fertilizers, they are what is known as tight markets. So the demand and supply are very closely balanced. And if demand changes or supply changes very rapidly, you get very big impacts.
Have led to food insecurity, energy insecurity, and really a dramatic decline and spiral. So there's a couple of questions there. One is how do we extricate ourselves? And do you feel that people like me have led to, frankly, a lot harder work for people like you? Let's do that in reverse order, shall we? That means Laura first. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah,
that's fine. I mean, my immediate response to your second question is that this is a situation in terms of the cascading effects between food and energy markets, high prices, high food insecurity, nutrition insecurity. You could take these aspects and take them away from the crisis in Ukraine, and they would still be happening more and more over the coming years. So it's the war in Ukraine is a trigger and an exacerbator and a multiplier of these threats, but these threats and risks were already there and are a function of many years of unsustainable production and unsustainable ways of ensuring access to food. And I think it's really, I guess, to go to your first point, I don't have short-term answers, although there are things that countries can do to help kind of stem the spiral in terms of being transparent about stocks, not resorting to export restrictions and hoarding, recognise that there's not yet a supply shortage, and switching to organic fertilizers to make sure that we have harvests in the coming seasons without synthetic fertilizers.
Right.
But I think that the kind of hard truths that it shone a light on in terms of dependence on interconnected systems, the vulnerability of low-income households to high prices, the importance of building in diversification to our systems so that we don't have the kind of reliance on a handful of commodities and a handful of breadbasket regions. These are things that we've been talking about for a long time and that we know need to change. So I wouldn't put the blame for this situation on you and sure. Your work. And I think it's an interesting case of kind of these two discussions coming together, but the question of sovereign independence shouldn't be seen, I don't think, as a contributor to resource insecurity.
Thank you for indulging me with that last bit. Anthony, back at you. You did talk about the solutions, but a little bit more, perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, on extricating ourselves from the spiral and the cascades.
Yes, I'll be brief because I think I covered some of it before. But yeah. I mean, in many parts of the world, in particular OECD countries, we waste huge amounts of energy, and we can be more efficient in terms of the way in which we use it. And I think, it is, everyone talks about energy efficiency, but very little is done on it. A colleague of mine, Walt Patterson, wrote a paper 15 years ago for Chatham House, in which he talked about loft insulation as a foreign policy tool, and saying this is the way in which we wean ourselves off dependency on countries that we don't want to be dependent upon. And if every year for the last 15 years, the UK government had done 4% of the houses in terms of, or 1 million houses per year in terms of home insulation, we would be in a very, very different place today. And I think it really is that simple. We have to bite the bullet and just get on with that in terms of measures that are potentially more expensive on the short term, politically more complicated, but yet absolutely necessary. So we do know what the answers are in terms of technologies. Just in terms of the other point is, the energy transition is difficult. It affects the whole of society and the whole of industry. And it also changes geopolitics. And I think that was a point that Tim made at the beginning in terms of Russia and the impact of the energy transition potentially on their role in the world. Because if we get off fossil fuels quite fast, then their political influence significantly diminishes. And I do think it's something that we need to think through in terms of the extent to which an energy transition has significant geopolitical implications and implications on different countries and relationships and coalitions going forward.
That's really interesting. Just as I don't mean this to sound a facetious point, Anthony, but I can't help but think of my own parents. And every time I go to their house, as they get older, the temperature of their house seems to increase a tremendous amount compared to many years ago. So I find it. I'd be interested to know maybe a little bit more if we have the time about how you can do that, exercise that self-restraint when people are individuals and they want to be warm and they seem to, and on an aging planet, they seem to require more warmth, it seems to me, over time. So is that, I mean, I know you want it, I know you need it, I know we all need it, but do you see that as realistic, that sort of, because you are talking about self-restraint, aren't you?
It's talking about different standards in terms of comfort. It may not be harmful. It's what people are used to. People very quickly change their patterns of living through socialization of new actions and new opportunities. So it isn't, people's houses are warmer today than they were beforehand, in sort of going back a number of years, and people live quite happily with slightly colder houses. So it's not an impossible thing for us to encourage. Interesting. Tim, right, you've given us the dim and gloom, but now obviously I'm going to ask you about you must see, or at least I hope you can see, a way to extricate ourselves from the spiral.
Oh, if only, James, if only. There are, as we talk about in the paper, and as Anthony talked about eloquently, there are many short-term things that we can do which will reduce the potential for the spike to get spiked. And particularly the shortest term things that we can do is around demand side issues. Now, it's perfectly possible to insulate your loft before next winter, but if you stop eating so much meat, particularly in the European market, one of my colleagues has calculated that a 15% switch to eating less chicken and pork would more than make up for all of the lost imports of grain from the Ukraine, because that typically goes into chicken and pork production in Europe. And in fact, most of our grain in Europe goes into meat production. It doesn't get eaten by humans. That's the kind of bread we eat, but most of it goes into animals. So eating less animals might allow us not to have to plough up all of our nature areas to grow more animal feed. So there are some immediate short-term things that we can do. But I think my final point in response to your second question is that there is an interesting interplay between sovereignty and global embeddedness in a globalized world and globalized supply chains. And to a certain extent, we're finding that in the UK with the kind of contradictions of Brexit, taking back control, but having no ability to exert that control because we're part of a kind of global network. And if we are moving towards a world where there are deglobalization pressures because the geopolitics is changing and we're moving into a bipolar world rather than a unipolar multilateral world, if we are moving towards a world which is more riven by shocks and crises, some of which are climate induced, what is the right balance between what we grow locally or what we produce locally and what we import and export? And does that switch towards actually a more resilient system is one which tends towards more self-sufficiency? And if we're in a new global trading world with a degree more self-sufficiency, can we use that at that time to provide an impetus to do some of the demand side issues around making the system better from a sustainability, from a human health, from a well-being perspective, and not just the focus of the last 20 years, which has been driving the system to make it as efficient and wealth creating as possible at the expense of everything else. And part of the everything else is its fragility to when something like this happens, that prices shoot through the roof.
Thank you very much indeed. Right. Ladies and gents, it's 10 to 1. As I say, we'll go until 10 past 1. So we've got 20 minutes for questions and far too many. So I apologize in advance. And I should slightly dictatorially just pick the questions out of the chat. First one, probably for you, Anthony, because it's about timelines from Sabrina Han. She says that the key question is time frame and how quickly energy diversification could happen. Even the US wants to increase its energy supply, and it says that first it needs to enlarge its energy production, refinery, transport facilities, which is going to take at least 5 years. So, I mean, I don't have any. I'm not apologizing for asking, but Anthony, I'm always asked about things like, when is Putin going to leave power and that kind of stuff. So, and obviously, impossible questions to answer. So, I'm asking you a little bit about timeframes and what is an absolutely necessary time frame to sort of. I mean, I know there's not an end result here, but to sort of to do this energy transition by. What are we looking at in terms of times to ensure perhaps that cascading effects and we don't, go past the point of no return at climate change happen? Can you say a little bit about timeframes?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously time frame in this case, in terms of looking at gas and European diversification. As I mentioned before, the EU is planning to increase the volume of imported LNG to 50 billion cubic meters per year. That is possible from an EU perspective with today's infrastructure. So that's why they can promise that by the end of the year, because the EU has existing infrastructure. It's not being optimized. It's not used to its full capacity. So that would be possible. So to some degree, there is infrastructure that can be used better. I say that within the EU. From an American perspective, where President Biden pledged an additional 15 BCM from the US this year, then that's the question that is being asked. And the US doesn't have that amount of gas just sitting around waiting for a new market. It has that. It is selling it to somebody, and it will now sell it to the EU. So it will take time for it to increase its production to rebalance that market in some way. And so that's why, in some way, come back to my point, many of the supply options take much longer than many of the demand side options. And just to finish up, obviously the supply options all have different degrees of lead times. So we talked earlier a bit about nuclear. I'd say that probably in terms of new supply is one of the longest lead times.
Yeah.
10 years to plan, 10 years to build, roughly.
Of course.
If we're talking about a wind turbine, you can put it up in 6 months once you've got the planning issues. So it's obviously much faster. So if we want to do more supply very rapidly, then there are some options that are better than others.
Interesting. Tim, do you have anything to say on timelines? And then I'm going to ask Laura an entirely different question. Do you have anything to add on timelines there?
Well, we have multiple crises in the sense that we've got the climate crisis. We've also got a global health crisis associated with poor diets. And we've got a global biodiversity crisis, and we've got the current supply crisis. And all of those, in a sense, means that some of the levers that we are traditionally reluctant to pull, such as some of the encouraging people to eat differently, will inevitably get pulled because prices are changing. So waste will go down because people can't afford to buy food. They'll buy different sorts of foods, and the more expensive foods will be the ones with the larger footprints. So to a certain extent, there will be a natural demand side change, but we ought to be. It's not about people's behavior, it's about getting the structure of the market right to enable and encourage people to eat less but better food rather than the kind of stuff that we produce at the moment. And there are many things that we can do in the immediacy. We've had years and years and years of crisis after crisis talking about building back better. Mm-hmm. Can we actually really think about this time taking the silver lining, as you called it, of the situation and saying, actually, we know we need to move. We know diets are killing us on a global basis. We know we've got to get the structure of the markets right. Let's do it, because we could do it almost immediately if we wanted to.
So how much, I mean, Ben, in that case, just a quick follow-up, Ben, can't help, but how much faith do you have in governments and multilateral organizations, but especially governments, that they can indeed say that say this time it's different? Do you...
rather less than I used to have before I started working in this space.
Okay, all right. I'm pushing 1 minute. Laura, I've got a different question for you, if I may. It's from Marie Riquier. I may have pronounced that incorrectly. I'm sorry. Marie asks, researchers found a link between food insecurity and instability. In some cases where other factors also play a key role in rising tensions. But the war in Ukraine, she says, threatening global food supplies and leading to rising global food and energy prices, stuff we've been talking about, likely to impact economy, food security of net importing countries. So what Mary is asking is, what are your thoughts on the risks of rising food insecurity leading to more instability across the globe?
I think it's a very real concern. In the report, we highlight in particular the situation in Egypt and Lebanon, both countries very dependent on imports in general, but especially on imports from Russia and Ukraine. Both countries already experiencing very high consumer prices before the invasion and rapidly rising food prices since the invasion. And both countries where there are or have been in the past the conditions in which social unrest can escalate. I mean, Tim mentioned the Arab Spring and the role of reduced exports from Russia and Ukraine in that instance, and contributing to rising bread prices, which contributed to or led to the food riots, which added to a maelstrom of contributing factors in that scenario. And to some degree, the situation could be a lot worse now. The kind of the price rises that we're seeing, like we said, are the highest on record. There could be significant supply impacts if fertilizer prices remain high and if producers aren't able to access the inputs they need, and if they aren't able to pivot to alternative methods, organic farming, for example. So I think the kind of risk level is pretty high. There are things that could be done to help manage that, and to some degree, it's the kind of market responses that we've talked about. So stopping a situation in which you see a wave of export restrictions for fear of domestic food insecurity. There have been, long run efforts to increase transparency in food markets to stop this kind of reactive protectionist behavior that really exacerbates situations like this. There are kind of system changes that can be made to increase redundancy in the system and therefore reduce both the immediate impact of price rises and to create a bit of a buffer situation for countries that are import dependent and that need to pivot to other suppliers. So strategic reserves, either at a country level or at a regional level, is again, something that has been under discussion for a very long time. And I think, it's also important to look at what social safety nets are in place. So Egypt subsidises heavily the cost of the price of bread, for example, and that is all well and good in times where we're not seeing price rises of the kind we're seeing now. But when governments kind of have those very high subsidies in place, when their overall finance is constrained, as it is in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and when prices rise very high, then that's completely unsustainable as a policy. And then, you see very kind of real escalation of insecurity and price rises in a country setting. So I think there are things to be done at national level, but more importantly at international level, to thinking about how we mitigate the impacts of shocks of this kind, of which we will see more and more as climate impacts worsen, and as we see the kind of large-scale movement of people as a result of climate change, as a result of conflict like this. These are all pressures that are only going to increase. So I think, arresting the rising risk of social unrest depends on system-wide action now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Laura. Must move on. Probably a penultimate question here, probably for you, Anthony. It's a question on sanctions by Megan Richards. And Megan's talking about the pressure on EU leaders to stop imports of oil and gas, easier for the US and the UK, as you say. And frankly, Anthony, as you probably know, I've been calling on sanctions to Russia, frankly, since about 2004, since say Litvinenko was poisoned in London, 16 years ago, right? But I still believe that. I'm a big believer in these sanctions for reasons we don't have time to go into here. But I have to concede that sanctions have consequences on all of us. They have sanctions obviously consequences on the receiver of sanctions, naturally, but also on the givers as well. And the question for Megan effectively is, where do you see the impact in terms of energy? I think obviously, where do you see the impact of sanctions hitting the most? Obviously on Russia, I presume, would be part of your answer. But do sanctions have unequal effects around the globe depending upon different countries, different positions and prosperities? So it's about where do you see sanctions hitting most?
It's a gradient probably, isn't it? In terms of even within the EU, the implications of sanctions of banning of Russian imports of energy will have huge impacts, varying impacts across the different member states. So it is about dependency. I talked about the figure about the sort of €1 billion a day that was being sent from the sale of energy to Russia. So clearly, cutting that off has a material impact in terms of Russian finance. On the short term, obviously, there is the question about on the longer term, does Russia just pivot towards the east and sell more of its energy, China, India, etc.
Yeah.
On the short term, in global markets, that's possible for some fuels, obviously less, as I've mentioned before, in terms of gas, in terms of pipelines. So there would be a material impact on Russia's finance were the EU to stop all energy imports. But it is that balance, because clearly higher energy prices affect the economic competitiveness of all countries, the abilities of people to buy energy for their own uses is also affected. So it is a balance. There isn't a simple answer.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for answering briefly, because maybe we can fit a couple more in, that means, as well. I'll move on, and probably for Tim, but it's up to you guys. Question for Sarah Schoenhardt from E&E News, talking about the connections between food and climate. Actually, so Laura as well, obviously. So the question is responses to, and my screen has just gone blank. No, I've got it back. Responses to the current food crisis could further set back climate efforts and deepen unsustainable agriculture practices. We're seeing a rise, for example, in palm oil, as I think Laura mentioned, from Indonesia to replace cooking oils from Russia and Ukraine, but palm oil is deeply tied to deforestation, apparently. So I suppose what I'm asking Tim and Laura perhaps is for Chatham House, I've understood for a long time now that Chatham House has been more concerned about climate change because of its planetary implications than anything else. My area of responsibility, international security, is global health. Absolutely, it is the most existential question we have. So could we talk about the climate change issue a little bit more, and how this particular shock, this latest of so many horrendous shocks, is going to set back, despite a little bit of talk about silver linings, set back what we have at least been attempting to do with climate change. I know we've covered this a little bit, but I'd like to go into the climate change issue a little bit more, please, Tim and Laura.
Shall I kick off? So we know that we emit lots of greenhouse gases that directly drive climate change, and some of these are from burning of fossil fuels, and some of these are from land use change, particularly cutting down forests to make agricultural land to produce food. So food is both a recipient of climate change and a driver of climate change. And yet at the same time, a lot of what we produce from in the food perspective doesn't aid people's health. Is primarily used for livestock feed to produce lots and lots of cheap meat and so on. Palm oil, you raise palm oil, has converted in parts of the tropic, non-economic, as a trade minister once said to me, non-economic rainforest into economic contributing oil production. But that oil production isn't needed from a nutritional perspective, and it is effectively part of the market for ultra-processed food, driven by a convenience perspective that has created this space. So climate change, because it's going to impact on the sorts of cascading risks we're talking about now, really is going to be defining the century of the way that people live and their ability to have lifestyles. In mitigating climate change, part of the way we can do that is instead of saying, let's grow as much food as possible, make it as cheap as possible so we can waste it and throw it away, and we can feed it to livestock and we can eat excessive meat. Were we to have a market system that allowed us to eat from a nutritional perspective, the right sorts of foods were priced in the right way, rather than cheaper foods being bad for us, more expensive foods being better for us, which is the way it typically works. Were we to have a system that was right, we could have both healthy diets, we could preserve land for nature, and we can deal with climate change. If we take a crisis like this and say, oh my God, we're not going to have enough cheap food on the market, we have to cut down more rainforests, we have to plough up nature land to make the cheap grain to go into the cheap meat, etc., then we set back the ability to deal with climate change. And over the long run, medium term to long term, the poorest people in the world will be the most affected by climate change. They will live lives that are increasingly really difficult. We'll have more cascading risks, more social insecurity, more conflict, more people movement because of climate change. This is not just a personal preference situation. This is an existential crisis from a global perspective, of which food and land and energy systems are integral. Laura, over to you.
Yes, exactly, Laura.
Just to add that, I think it's really difficult in this situation to say, look, immediate measures to increase supply and aim to lower prices is not the right way to go, that we need to think of the long term, because people are in a really precarious situation and there does need to be support to kind of mitigate those worst impacts. But the fact is that we will be in this situation over and over again. And at some point, you know, you need to break that cycle and realize that what we're doing to supposedly mitigate the worst impacts is actually exacerbating the situation. And, you know, Tim's talked a lot about intergenerational equity. Those issues are really important to think about, that, you know, measures we take now, short-term measures that don't prioritize long-term resilience, will have impacts on our children, our grandchildren. I mean, we were having a discussion between colleagues yesterday, and one pointed out that it's the unknowability of the timeline of the climate impacts that we're going to see that make this situation really difficult, that make it difficult to prioritize long-term resilience over short-term action, because we can see the impacts that we're having now, you know, impacts of high prices, and we can look to short-term measures to try and manage those. And we know, you know, what's happening when and how we can have an immediate impact, maybe for the better in the near term. But we don't know when the climate impacts that we know are coming will really be felt in different societies. And I think that kind of gives rise to a kind of paralysis, and really makes it very difficult to argue against the kind of calls that we're seeing from different quarters now to prioritize ramping up production over sustainability requirements. And it's a catch-22, and it, you know, there's no easy way out. But the fact is that the science is there to show us that we will face these high prices again and again, that the future is one of market volatility, supply constraints, high prices, increasing human insecurity. So it's the responsibility of those acting now to respond not only to the immediate crisis, but to those that we know are coming down the line.
Thank you, Laura. Can I just make one final point for you to riff off, perhaps Tim, as a way of sort of closing out the whole thing, because I see we're at 13:09. It's a point made by Tim Ash, and Tim says, okay, my computer's gone. Yeah, Tim says that surely experience from the EU Common Agricultural Policy is that when we manage markets, we can engineer a hugely powerful supply response. We've been using things like this, like set aside to reduce agricultural output. So he says, so Tim's asking, why can't we just reverse these? It's not just about food and energy security. He says, if we value security, Tim says, then markets have to be managed better. And of course, there's a cost for this. And I leave that with you, maybe Tim, just to sort of, as a final point, maybe to just honestly to close out on here.
Yeah, well, there is a growing kind of political desire to leave markets as alone as possible, and say if only we remove all regulations, markets will function perfectly. And I think our learning is that they don't.
Yeah.
The more we deregulate markets, the more they lead to the unintended consequences, including the externalization of costs on health systems and environmental systems. So the question is not, do we deregulate markets, but do we structure the markets to deliver the social goods that we want? And we can do that much better than we currently do now. And just to end up on, whilst we've been talking about this being a current crisis, if we are changing the structure of the markets, if new geopolitical alliances come out, if we're changing patterns of trade, if we're investing in new energy systems and advancing the weaning ourselves off Russian gas, we are going to be in a situation where these changes will embed in new ways of working. And those will have consequences for decades ahead. So this is not just a, can we cope with food and energy price changes? It is, as we go through this process, whatever happens to the war, whether the war lasts months, years, or whatever, we will be in a very, very different market. And how can we both manage that transition, but manage some of the social costs that we're talking about, the intergenerational issues, the sustainability issues, in a way that gives us the most ability to deal with this and develop social goods, and not just focus on the immediacy of the short-term responses that we can throw things at today.
Thank you, Tim. Listen, I must close it out here, ladies and gents. I only really want to close by saying thank you to Laura, Tim, and Anthony for being panelists, and what is it, 9 authors of this fantastic paper, which I think, as all environment and society papers do, it teaches that there are very consequences to our actions, and that does this more effectively than ever, and it's an incredibly valuable part in addition to this, and it certainly teaches me in my slightly narrow outlook on the Russia-Ukraine war, but there are absolute consequences to policy recommendations and consequences to attitudes, much as obviously I believe, as I always have done, in the need for the Ukraine to fight for its independence and its rights and its ambitions and what it needs to have for 45 million people in its post-independence life. But there is so much more to it than we see in this traditional security field. So my thanks again. I'm sorry we could have gone on for at least another few hours. I'm absolutely sure, because it's such a rich paper and there's been 33 questions and I think I've asked about 4 of them. Terrible chairing. And again, hopefully we can get back to this and we can have many more discussions along these lines. So thanks, Laura, Anthony, Tim, and obviously Anna, who organised this. All the best. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us.